Okay, we're in server 06, and the difference really here is we've got our mutation to create a task, and we're just outputting all the variables that come through. We create a new task, we spread all the args inputs and the math random, and then we push it onto the array, and we have our mutation here and our query variable tab. So if we come in and if we copy this query or mutation, and we're going to pass in some variables here. We can pass in this. There we create a new task, ID tuner test. We can say test 2 here. Put this to, we assign it, we can say completed. So set that to true. User ID 1, let's put that down as user 2. And do that. That's 2, and that belongs to Ted. So we can see our mutation. We have our input. We've created in here our input variable type. We have our mutation, and down here in the schema we've created our mutation. We say a create task that takes in a create task input type, and it has to be of type task. Create task input, it returns back. So it has to be of type create task input, and it returns back a task. Here's a create task input, name string boolean. We can set it to false by default if we want to, or to, so we don't actually have to put it in. So if we come back here and actually take this out, let's see what happens there. Run, that's fine, that all works. So we can do test 4, test 3, user 3. That's because it's passed as default, so we can see how we can send in default values and a user ID, and it returns back as something of type task, and a type task has an ID, name, completed, and an optional user. Obviously we can make these non-required or required as we wish. And finally, when we go into our client, we can see here we have a task. If we go into app06, exactly the same. We've seen this before, where we can pass in that same mutation. Has to be part of a query object because we're actually sending a query through, even though it contains a mutation. We pass in the variables, and if we open up this page, add task, open with live server, there we can see task 8 added with 9648. There we're getting that. If we refresh the page, task 7, task 2, task 1, it's making a random number for the title of the task, but it's giving it an ID here. So if we look at the code for that, when we come into app06, we can see down, sorry, in server 06, when we're creating our mutation down here, we can say we're inputting, the ID is a random number between 0 and like 10,000, and the name pushing on the sort of the task. Create task is input ID is the input variables that we pass in, and we can see down here task name 7, task name 2. How is that being formed? That is task 8, name task 8. Args. And we can see here in app06 in the actual client request, the name of the new task is task plus a random number between 0 and 10, completed false, user ID of 1. Obviously we could change all of that, and that's getting put in there. So when we come to the page and to refresh, the task name is random number there, and we get a random number ID, but we see the task created, ID name completed false. So what we've done in this sort of course is basically seen how we can do this resolve information. Before we had a many-to-many with users containing lists of tasks. Here we're just seeing our basic username and actually having our dependency just in the tasks, but we have been able to resolve for a particular task all the users and vice versa, simply because as soon as we get any of the IDs here, we can in our resolvers, as we've seen here, we can in our resolvers find out, for example, get task by user ID. We can get all the information we required because we can resolve down to task and user as well as user and task. So we can basically make basically a join table. So that's the end of courses 02, which has been a sort of a recap and going over plus new information on GraphQL.